Ladies and gents, welcome here, who are physically present and who are present online. We do have this event held in person at Chatham House and online. It's on the record. We will start with opening remarks of three brilliant co-authors of the brilliant book on Alexei Navalny, and online guests are welcome to send their questions. Those who are here can show their hands to ask questions. And let me first introduce our speakers. My own name is Nikolai Petrov. I am Senior Research Fellow here at Russian and Eurasian Program. And we're lucky to have three authors with us. Let me introduce them in the order they will speak. Here is Navalny Vladimir, who is PhD student at the University of Kent, and he is studying Navalny and the opposition in general. Then we do have Ben Noble, who is Associate Fellow of Russian and Eurasian Program, and who is a lecturer at University College London. And we do have Jan-Matti Dolbaum, who is postdoctoral researcher at Bremen University, focused on activism and civil society in Russia. And our lady is Tamila Lankina, Professor of International Relations from London School of Economics, who is studying a lot of different things, including comparative democracy and authoritarianism. Just a couple of opening remarks. We will open for the questions from the audience and from those who are watching us online. And please send your questions. I'll see them. And please raise your hands. With saying this, I'd like to start our event. And Navalny Vladimir, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would first like to thank the organizers of this event. We're very excited to be presenting the book in person for the first time at Chatham House. So we thank Anna Morgan, Nikolai Petrov, Tamila Lankina, and James Nixie. So who is Alexei Navalny? That question was on everybody's minds. First, for people who are interested in Russian politics for a number of years now, but it was also and suddenly in the minds of people who are interested in global politics, first when Navalny was poisoned last August, then when, with the help of investigative organization Bellingcat, they claimed to reveal who had poisoned them. And then finally, when Navalny returned to Russia, and at the time, everybody around us, colleagues, people who weren't necessarily interested in Russian politics, wanted to know more about Alexei Navalny. And at that time, Ben Noble got in touch with me and Jan-Matti Dolbaum and asked us a very academic question: is there a good English language book on Navalny? And the answer was no, there is no such book. So after a very short discussion, we decided to write that book. And yeah, so we wrote it quite quickly. We wanted it to be out before the Russian legislative elections, which took place in the last few days. So, who is Alexei Navalny? I will start with a disclaimer. We do not claim to provide a definitive answer to that question. We didn't set up to write a traditional biography ordered in chronological order with testimonies from his childhood friends. What we tried to do is to present who Alexei Navalny is to a Western audience. And to do so, we divided Navalny's political trajectory, Navalny's political career in three streams. Ben Noble will talk about this later. But we also wanted to do something more, which is not only tell the story of Alexei Navalny, the man, which was the subject of many profiles in the press, but also talk about Navalny and his movement, like Navalny once said in an interview, the collective Navalny. And the final thing we wanted to do, which is something that Jan will talk about later, is we wanted to put Navalny in the context of Russian politics and in the context of his interaction with the Kremlin, to look at how Navalny has shaped Russian politics and how the Kremlin, Russian politics, the Russian political field in general has shaped Navalny. We wrote that book, as we said, in the context when Navalny was returned to Russia. And the background of that context was an extreme politicization and polarization of Navalny's case. In the Western press, of course, the main tone of the story was one of great heroism, which is the story of Navalny is undoubtedly about this. But on the other hand, very quickly, you had people, usually closer to the Kremlin, let's say, who introduced some criticism of Navalny, in particular Russia Today, who was very quickly trying to portray Navalny as an ugly racist, a nationalist, and who was calling out the Western hypocrisy on Navalny's case, saying basically Navalny would be canceled in the West if he were a Russian politician. What we found interesting is that not all that Russia Today says is untrue, and we tried to shed light on these accusations to present the shades of gray of Alexei Navalny. We do not mean this as a way to delegitimize his political struggle against the Kremlin. We wanted to put all the facts for the public to judge. There was also another type of politicization, polarization that was at play at the time and still is right now, is the tension between a tendency, again, in the Western media to overblow the importance of Navalny and to say, to caricature a bit, that should Navalny run in a free election, he would defeat Vladimir Putin outright. And on the other hand, on the Kremlin hand, if you will, there was this tendency to present Navalny as a simple-time blogger, someone with very limited following, mostly people from big cities, internet users. And so these are the two poles of polarization, let's say, that we tried to avoid in the book. We tried to trace his trajectory, his political trajectory in the Russian political field, to put it in the context of the major transformations that have taken place in Russian politics for now more than 20 years. Navalny started his career in the early 2000s, and we tried to adopt a balanced and approach to present who actually is Navalny. And I will hand the floor to Ben Noble.
Thanks for that, Morgan. I think lots of people, when they look at Navalny, a word that might come to mind is that he's complex. So what does that mean in practice? And please indulge me, I'm going to read a paragraph or two from the book, if only so that I can raise the book for those in the room and those online. So we think that Navalny is different things to different people. To some, he's a democratic hero, a figure willing to stand up to Putin's authoritarianism. Some even call him the leader of the opposition. To others, he's a traitor, a CIA paid agent of the West who's betraying the motherland. To others still, he is a nationalist or a xenophobe. Even a quick glance at Navalny's words and deeds makes clear why people might be confused. He's a liberal who's made nationalist, even racist statements. He's an anti-corruption activist who himself has been convicted of embezzlement. He's a Russian patriot who calls for sanctions against Russian authorities. He's an avowed Democrat who leads his movement with a strong hand. Navalny wants Russia to be happy, but attacks opponents with scathing comments and rarely backs down. In the book, the major way that we try and tackle that complexity is by looking at three strands of Navalny, and that is his role as an anti-corruption activist, his role as a politician, and also his role as a protest leader. I'm going to speak about the first two of those in a bit more detail before handing over to Jan to talk about his role in process, but more broadly his movement and how they've adapted with the Kremlin. So lots of people, especially for those who don't follow Russia day to day, will have come across Navalny at the beginning of this year on his return to Russia, as well as when the Anticorruption Foundation dropped the Putin's Palace investigation. And it now has, I think, 118 million views on YouTube. But his anti-corruption investigations began way before that. And in conducting the research for the book, it almost seems like he stumbled upon anti-corruption as a topic, anti-corruption investigations as an activity. So he is a member of the emerging post-Soviet middle class in Russia, and he decides to buy stocks. So he's got stocks in these companies, but very quickly he doesn't get information that he wants. For example, who are the other people who own stocks in this particular company and what's happening to the profits? So he begins to go to shareholder meetings. He begins to ask questions, and it's very clear that he's able to do it in a provocative manner that gets people listening. And so he starts cataloging these questions that he's asking and the fact that he isn't getting responses on LiveJournal, which is a really popular blog in Russia at the time. And we can see by looking at these posts on LiveJournal how he is generating interest and how he's creating a following. You can just look at the number of comments that are posted on these anti-corruption investigations that he posts on his blog. You can see people are interested, and he very quickly becomes one of the best known bloggers in Russia. And the topic becomes politicized, and he emerges as a political figure. And this is certainly reflected in the fact that international press starts paying attention to him at the time. So we tell that story in chapter 2, but we also in that chapter show how he starts building his team. He has people interested in these blog posts, but he also realizes that he's getting inundated with people saying, well, have you looked at this? Have you looked at that? He starts pulling together people who can help him on this journey, and he starts various initiatives like looking at potholes with the Rosyama project. And we come up with the subheading in the book that he politicizes potholes, because he looks at this particular area, which you can imagine which would be deeply dull, but in Navalny's hands, it becomes something really engaging. And you can start seeing his humor being used to particular effect, to take a dull subject, to make it interesting, and to make it political. In chapter 2, we also look at the role of corruption more broadly in Russia and how it relates to politics. We also discuss some of the accusations that have been made against Navalny, that he's merely a puppet for other interests. And we look at the creation of the Anticorruption Foundation. I should say, when we were writing the book, near the end of the process, that's when we saw his organizations being labeled extremist. And so we were reconstructing a history at the same time, in real time, that these organizations were being deconstructed very, very quickly. In chapter 3, we look at Navalny's role as a politician. And in chapter 2, it's very clear that he's already making his activities political. But we begin chapter 3 with him trying to stand in the 2018 presidential election. Navalny isn't trying to hide anything. He then wanted to become president of Russia. And I imagine he would want to become president of Russia if he were released from prison, although from the book, we include lots of evidence to suggest that that would be unlikely that he would, but who knows what will happen in the future. So when looking at his political activities, we look at what he did in the 1990s, how he joined Yabloko, how he clashed with certain personalities in the party, and that was very much the sort of liberal phase of his early political career. But then we see his flirtations with nationalism, which is certainly one of the areas of his biography, and one of the areas of the things that he said that has been most contentious, and is one of the reasons why we wanted to write the book, to put into context these very controversial things that he said, not in a way to try and say that this isn't important. We focus on it squarely in the book and try and situate it in historical context and make clear how his political positions have changed over time. Things that he might have said in 2007 when he was involved with the Narod movement, he wouldn't say now. It's another question whether he still thinks it, but in the book, we're very honest and we say we can't get inside his head. We weren't able to sit down with him for hour upon hour and interview him. That might be for another book on Navalny. This isn't the book that we wrote. We have drawn on what he has said in past interviews, what he said on his blogs, as well as what Russian journalists and journalists outside Russia have written about him. And something that comes across in the politician chapter, which is chapter 3, is really how much of a chameleon he is, how much he really has changed, how much he adapts over time. And one simple interpretation of that is that he's just a very good politician. He plays to the crowd and he's able to adapt, given not only what people think in the crowds in front of him, but also how the Kremlin has been able to adapt. Some people have charged him in that regard of being inconsistent, as somebody who can't be trusted. But on that point, let me again read a couple of chapters from, a couple of chapters, don't worry, a couple of paragraphs from the book. So, the story of Navalny's journey as a politician can be bewildering. This comes at the end of chapter 3 when we're trying to make sense of the many twists and turns in his political career. At some points, he's called for the liberal opposition to unite. Then he opted to go alone. Regarding elections, he sometimes called for boycotts, but then for the fielding of opposition candidates, and then for protest voting, like we've seen with the smart voting project in these elections. Sometimes slogans are central, at other times they're rejected as simplistic. Then they're back in favor once again. How should we make sense of these zigzags? Is it a sign of inconsistency? One may well call him inconsistent, an opportunist for these turns, like his less pragmatic colleagues in the liberal opposition have constantly done. That's the accusation against him. But in reality, they appear to reflect Navalny's readiness to subordinate both tactics and substantive demands to the one thing that he has been remarkably consistent about: the need to fight an authoritarian system that uses corruption and repression to secure power. So that's how we try and make sense of these inconsistencies. It's not to throw our arms up into the air and say, well, you make sense of it. We show that this is a politician trying to act in very difficult circumstances where the rules of the game are not being written by him, they're being rewritten and he's having to adapt. And then in the fourth chapter, we turn to Navalny as a protest leader. And we begin by looking at the protests that we saw at the beginning of this year. But let me now hand over to my co-author, Jan, to talk about that in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Ben. So chapter 4, Navalny the protester. Navalny has, of course, been a protester pretty much since he's been politically conscious, but he's been using protest, trying to incorporate protest into his political project at some point after the big protest wave of 2011, 2012, where he realized that that is a good opportunity. He was forced into that, into taking protest more seriously, partly because that was one of the few channels that was still open for him, because he was trying to be a normal politician, as we say in the book, as he says himself, but he was frustrated in that endeavor time and time again, and saw street protest as a channel to deliver his political message. But he also realized that big protest events, large crowds gathering, have a specific role to play in building a political project, political movement in and of themselves. And so what we do in the book is trace this strategic effort to build his political movement through protest. And we do that on the example of his presidential campaign in 2017 leading into 2018, where we break this down to 3 steps. The first being the now very famous video on alleged corruption of then Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev that went viral on YouTube. And that was then followed by the second step, large protest events organized by Navalny's team across the country. And these events were sometimes the largest that these places had seen in many years, sometimes even decades. And they mobilized people who hadn't been in touch with politics before. Some established activists went there, of course, but many, many people who hadn't gone to a demonstration before in their entire lives. And then this was followed up by step 3, the opening of a set of regional offices in the regions. And all of these people who were enthused, inspired by this atmosphere at the protest events, then had something to go to, had a place to really engage in their newly found identity of activists, right? So this was really how this movement was constructed, how this political project was constructed, and protests played really a key role in that. And the movement that was the result of this was very consciously a hybrid thing. It had elements of a social movement where you had enthused activists, people with very different political positions, sometimes even people without any preconceived political positions, newcomers, established activists, people who were united really by their desire for a more democratic Russia, a Russia without a politicized justice system, a Russia without corruption, but really not so much a distinct set of policy positions as you might perhaps expect from a political party, right? So this was the social movement aspect of it. But then we also had the very centrally controlled, top-down structured political organization, where the activists didn't really have a say in what the leaders do at the top and who the leaders actually are. So these are two elements that are combined in this movement that are in tension with each other, but that also complement each other, and that really work to make the movement strong and attractive, but also to make it flexible in the very much changing political environment. And I think this flexibility might be one reason for the Kremlin to now have decided to cut it down and to really dismantle the movement altogether. And sort of with this, we get to the final point, which is the relationship between the Kremlin, the authorities, and Navalny. And we very much work against the idea that the Kremlin is this giant block that isn't dynamic, that is just static and sitting there. But no, I think, and there's very good work that we build on that says, no, the authorities are learning and adapting as much as Navalny's team and other oppositionists are learning and adapting constantly. And I want to just reiterate two of these examples we show for this adaptation process. The first is the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which can be read in this interpretation of adaptation, and that shows that this adaptation isn't just repressive. It's also that the Kremlin has, tried, and in this instance very successfully tried, to build emotional connections to the population, and also to drive a deep wedge into the nationalist camp by co-opting nationalism. The ideology of nationalism was no longer available for opposition, right? Which is an important point, even in Navalny's biography. The second example is the use of information. So Russia, of course, has been an autocratic regime for most of its post-Soviet existence, but this autocracy has been rather soft in a way. There have been always openings, possibilities for real opposition to engage, also independent media to exist. And Navalny has been very adept at using these little spaces that were left, also on social media, but also reporting on independent media about his protest actions, for example, right, to generate name recognition. And now the Kremlin has decided to cut down these spaces one by one, labeling independent media as foreign agents, interfering with Navalny's websites, shutting them down, even forcing foreign companies like Google and Apple to take down Navalny's app, as we've seen recently. So the soft authoritarianism has been giving way to a more traditional repressive form of authoritarianism, particularly in the last year. And sort of wrapping this up, going back to the writing process that my co-authors have been talking about, we've been challenged by this very rapid unfolding of events while we were writing the book, but we think it's not dated yet, because we locate all of these events in a sort of longer dynamic that we've been showing, this interaction between Navalny and the Kremlin, that some might even call a dance between them. Sort of, you cannot understand the movements of one party without looking at the movements of the other party. And I think with this, we can close and hand over to Mila.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. Now we've ended with introductory notes from within the team of authors, and we can listen to Tamila to, well...
from outside, so
yeah,
to speak.
How it looks from outside.
Thank you. First of all, it's a great pleasure for me to be part of this panel and to give some brief comments on this really amazing book. I won't repeat what the panelists have already said about the structure and the key points. I do want to reiterate, as somebody from the outside now, that it is an extremely balanced book. It really doesn't shy away from dealing with some really difficult questions. And another thing I wanted to say is that it would be a great disservice for us to say that it's a biography of Navalny. It's not a biography. It delves into deeper questions like, where do these activists come from? What motivates them? Why are there so few of them against a society that appears to be passive and largely disengaged? And I'll come back to that. And will they succeed, of course? So I will divide my comments into sort of three big themes that I take from this book. One is the generic profile of the opposition leader in Russia. And here, again, something that the three authors haven't actually mentioned is the book is very rich on not just giving us biographical details and political and campaign anti-corruption activism biography of Navalny, but also of people around him. So we get a profile of people who we didn't really know very much about since until about a year ago, right? They all sort of, a lot of them emerged actually after he was jailed, like Maria Pievchuk, they were sort of the figures, I don't want to use the word gray figures, but they were certainly in the shadows, doing a lot of heavy lifting. But we learn about their biographies. And to me, this kind of speaks to a very interesting strand of literature now on the sociology of the Russian middle class and the kind of different strands within the Russian middle class. The American professor Bryn Rosenfeld has a very good book about that, the state-dependent middle class, it is called. So we have different shades of middle class. The people that we see being bussed into polling stations the last 3 days, that's of the state-dependent variety. And it's not just because they don't have ideological convictions or anything, it's because they're dependent. They're the kind of semi-precariat, even if they're white-collar employees, so semi-precariat of modern-day Russia. And then you have people like Navalny's and his team, who are the epitome of the modern autonomous professional. So I use the word autonomy again, that comes from the sociology of the middle class in Russia. They work in the professions, and as the authors have mentioned, Navalny, there are some interesting biographical features. Not many of us knew that he was a stockbroker, but he was a minority shareholder activist. So he was a lawyer. He wasn't one of those teachers or nurses in the kind of public sector dependent sort of middle class. And likewise, the other people around him, they come from the Soviet, going back to the Soviet era, intelligentsia. Their parents, grandparents were kind of academics, engineers, thinkers, creatives, etc. So that's very interesting. I'll come back to that. We also, and that's the second big thing I take from this book, we learn about divisions within the political opposition in Russia. And that's very important. Yabloko's ambivalent attitude towards Navalny has been for a long time around. Navalny was kicked out of Yabloko for his nationalist views, but also even in the latest elections, this ambivalence has played out in divisions about how to approach smart voting. Yabloko people think it's if you vote smart, to use Navalny's strategic terminology, you're voting for Gulag supporters and people who will restore the Stalinist terror and all that, and who are nationalists like Prilepin and others, and it's a bad thing to do. So these fissures are there, as indeed fissures within the group of Navalny supporters. Navalny and his team use the word shtaby, as the authors write, as the headquarters of their, or rather what's the military for Stab what's the English?
In the book, we call it a military headquarters.
Military headquarters, right. So it's almost like this kind of jargon to describe a very centralist mode of decision making. So on the one hand, Navalny speaks about how we can't decide everything in Moscow, we need to let the people decide, the grassroots, but then, you know, the local campaigners, and they quote them saying, well, everything we do, every little video we produce, we have to kind of согласовывать or coordinate everything with the kind of the leading Stab or the headquarters. So it's those kinds of fissures that the authors don't shy away from describing. And the third big theme I take from this, and it's very, very important, is about the nature of the issues around which Navalny and his supporters rally. And the panelists have already mentioned anti-corruption as a kind of broad umbrella theme around which a lot of the issues that they campaign for coalesce. And that's actually also an example of very clever, strategic, in what social movement literature would call framing. You know, they found a frame that appeals to a lot of different people and unites a lot of different mini campaigns across Russia. So I've studied protest movement, and I know that actually beneath the surface, there's a lot of stuff bubbling at the level of kind of precincts, districts, local towns against corrupt mayors, but not just corruption. It's about ecological damage, or parks that are not built for playgrounds, not built for children, etc. And it's really, it kind of boils down to corruption. Public services are shoddy because of corruption. Environmental damage is being done because, you know, there are greedy developers who pay the bride, etc., etc. So we learn about this kind of campaigning, but ultimately the tragedy of Navalny and his team lies in the fact that, so on the one hand, he strategically in the past might have appealed to popular sentiment and is very attuned to the nationalist kind of patriotic sentiment of the population, and that alienated a large chunk of the bona fide kind of intelligentsia, intellectuals. They're dismissive of him because he's not necessarily one of us. He's, you know, somebody who was born in a village. So that's coming to the question of, again, divisions among the middle class and among the intelligentsia. But on the other hand, for his successful campaigns against corruption, he uses slick videos and all those very sophisticated kind of Twitter, Instagram, that is only used and leveraged by quite a modest size, I would say, of the Russian share of the Russian population. Even Putin is perhaps an embodiment of this when he was addressed by a young boy and he appeared not to know what YouTube is or hasn't used it. So maybe that's emblematic of that. And that brings me to, and I will be wrapping up shortly, to the big questions that that are close to my heart, because I've written a whole book about this. You're welcome to pick up some leaflets. It's called State Origins of Democracy in Russia. And it's about the nature of divisions within Russian society that we forget about and we don't really delve into. We forget that Russia, at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, has been a country divided into estates, soslovia, where only 30% of the peasantry were literate, generally speaking, in European Russia. So a massively illiterate country with a large peasant population that have been enserfed for a very long time. And the Soviet Union only put a plaster on it. It created a new kind of very precarious type of intelligentsia that are now and their descendants are continue to be in sort of mid or low level precarious state dependent jobs. And these are the people that become unwitting enablers of the Putin regime. These are the people who are being bussed into, who are just so vulnerable and so precarious. And we have to understand that just like at the time of the revolution, only, and that's being generous, about 20% of the Russian population, and mostly of the noble, merchant meshani, the urban estates, and the clergy were educated and were joining the modern professions. And when I see the very slick and smart and suave presenters, for instance, on TV Rain. I see descendants of those educated, what I call educated estates in my book. And I look at the people who are being bussed in, and I see these divisions that within Russian society that are very deep. You mentioned, for instance, university degrees. How come university degree holding does not predict support for Navalny? Well, everybody knows about the university degrees in Russia. Putin notoriously plagiarized his own dissertation, and a university degree in Russia doesn't say very much. They're produced like pancakes. It's that kind of almost dynastic pedigree in Russia that matters for whether you become one of those very few people who are, you know, the kind of the core intelligentsia, who are the core anti-Putin sort of people who might unite, coalesce, and continue to bravely fight that regime because they have the means, the capacity, and they're in autonomous rather than state-dependent professions. And then there's the rest of the population. I think if we don't understand it, we will not quite understand the enigma of Russian politics. And actually, at the end, the authors provide a very beautiful quote from Navalny, and I'll end with that quote, which shows his own appreciation of the weight of Russian history in shaping Russian politics. Navalny says, we have to fight not only against the lack of freedom in Russia, but also against the lack of happiness. We have everything, but we are an unhappy country. Read Russian literature, and it's just unhappiness and suffering. We are in a circle of unhappiness, and we can't get out of it. But of course, we want to. So this book is an excellent portrait of one brave man's struggle to tackle head-on these enigmas of Russian society that are actually, as I argue, deeply rooted in Russia's tragic past. Thank you. I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tamila. You brought us exactly to the core of our today's discussion. And let me remind you that this is not that much about Navalny's personality, but this is about Navalny's politics and its impact on to what's going on in Russia. And today the timing is brilliant because, as you perhaps know, we are at the end of Russian parliamentary elections when we can estimate how exactly Navalny himself and his team and his tactics offered did or did not influence results. So I would, first of all, ask all those who are listening to us to send their questions, so to be ready with them. But let me ask at the very beginning of our Q&A session, all authors of the book, what is your take on Russian Duma elections with regard to Navalny's politics and with regard to his tactics, whether he made a mistake when coming back to Russia earlier this year or not, and why it went in a way it went. Who is the first to answer this?
So I'll address the question of whether it was a mistake to return. That is a question that I think we've all been asked many times this year. And my response is that no, it wasn't a mistake, because in Navalny's mind, he wasn't weighing up whether he should return. For him, it was never a question. So the idea of a mistake makes it seem as though he was thinking strategically, should I return? What are the costs and the benefits? In a sense, he was simply completing the journey that he started when he took off from Tomsk on the 20th of August, 2020. So that's one reading of it. But also, he's been adamant that he wants to be a Russian politician in Russia, and that if he didn't return, if he stayed in exile, if he stayed in Germany, that he would be marginalized. And I think that's very true. So for him, he returned to Russia to be a Russian politician in Russia, but also because he knew that it would put the Kremlin in a very difficult situation, that it would be likely that they would lock him up. And one thing that we've argued a bit in the book, but we've also developed a bit in the writing that we've done since the book, is that this was an opportunity for Navalny to force the Kremlin to show its hand, to show that it is the type of regime that will lock up the most vocal, most visible critic of the sitting president. So Navalny was doing a couple of things by returning, so that the idea of whether it's a mistake is a bit odd. Now, did he foresee the extent to which his movement would be stamped upon, repressed? I don't think so. And certainly when we were writing the book, we didn't imagine that the repression was going to be as wide and as deep as it had been. So I think it's an open question whether, if he knew that that was going to happen, would he have done things differently? That's an open question, and we don't try and answer that in the book. But going back to something that Jan said, we hope the book isn't dated, because it's very clear in the book the direction of travel, the tightening that was happening, that the Kremlin had clearly had enough, and that it was taking steps to deal with Navalny and his movement in a way that it hadn't done before. So I'll leave it maybe to my co-authors to add to that or to tackle the election question.
Sure, I can pick up there. It's precisely to extend that thread that we open in the book to the recent elections. And of course, the results are not completely in yet. But what we see is that United Russia has apparently managed to receive a constitutional majority. And the smart voting campaign that Navalny has been trying to push and to operate hasn't perhaps brought the result that some have hoped it would. Of course, it was targeted by the authorities very heavily before the elections took place. The websites were blocked, etc., what we've mentioned already. But we also are seeing that some of the candidates that the smart voting supported, so these are recommendations to vote for specific opposition candidates in order to take all of the opposition-minded voters and move them towards one candidate in order to make the United Russia candidate lose, right? That in Moscow, some of these districts were actually led by candidates supported by the smart voting initiative. But when the electronic results, the results of the electronic voting were coming in, and they were coming in with a little delay of several hours or even 12, 15 hours, suddenly the candidates of United Russia seem to be the front runners again. So we don't know whether that's due to falsifications or not, but we do know is that obviously the smart voting was something that the Kremlin took very seriously in its approach. And that is precisely a continuation of what we say in the book, is this interaction that we've been describing, right? Navalny and his team trying to use different small openings, and then the authorities reacting towards that use of these small openings, whether that's through falsifications, whether that's through discreditation campaigns or what have you. But we see the interaction continued now during these elections.
Thank you. Marwan?
Yeah, I do think that it's a bit early to assess whether smart voting has had an impact on the results and what impact it will have in the shorter or medium term. What I think is interesting is that apparently from the results that we do have, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation has had pretty good results. And I think it's a very interesting point to illuminate also what is Navalny's approach to politics, which is a very pragmatic, and because most of the recommendations for smart voting were for communist candidates. And it's something that Navalny has been saying for many years now, that the opposition must try to unite, even if it's only tactically, in order to exploit the cracks in the system. And that in this fight against the authoritarian regime in Russia, the opposition should not concentrate on ideological differences. And this is something that sets Navalny quite apart from many people in the liberal opposition in Russia, in saying that, well, I don't mind if somebody is, as he once said, like if somebody wears a Lenin pin and goes to the election and can defeat United Russia, well, that's a good thing, and I will support that candidate. And now it remains to be seen whether these people that have been supported by smart voting will exploit these opportunities themselves. That is, will they try to be more vocally against the Kremlin, let's say. I think that the example of what happened in the Moscow City Duma that was elected, if I'm not mistaken, 2 years ago, showed that within these younger leaders of the Communist Party, you do find people who are willing to exploit a seat in a regional or in a city Duma to be more vocally critical of the Kremlin. And I think that going beyond the case of Navalny, which again we try to do in the book, it remains something to be followed, whether these other brand of oppositionists, whether within the system or outside the system, will use these opportunities.
I just wanted to add something quickly, that it's been clear for a while that the support for the Communist Party, KPRF, has been rising. And it's far from clear whether we can attribute that to the fact that Team Navalny has been saying, vote for these candidates. And we know, certainly when it comes to smart voting, these recommendations were released only a short time before the elections themselves. So I think if we see any type of narrative emerging from the opposition saying smart voting has had a real impact, pointing purely at the Communist Party seats in the State Duma, they are not acting like good social scientists. We need to be much more cautious, and it takes a while to try and work out what the impact precisely of smart voting is beyond the independent appeal of these other parties. Remember that smart voting, they are recommending candidates who are independently best positioned, according to Team Navalny, to beat the United Russia or the authorities' pick. So I think we are social scientists, so we have to encourage other people to remain cautious and not to say that the Communist Party, what seems like the Communist Party's success in these elections, yes, of course, they haven't got a majority in the State Duma, but they have improved on the number of seats that they had in the 7th convocation. And the final point that I wanted to make is that we talk about in the book stage 1 and stage 2 politics. And I think that's really important when we're trying to make sense of the idea that Team Navalny are saying you can vote for somebody wearing a Lenin pin. Ideologically, lots of the members of Team Navalny are liberals, and they do not support the ideological platform of the Communist Party. And yet, they see at the moment stage 1 is taking on the current political system, and they want to create a broad coalition of people with vastly different ideological positions to do that. But then once the current system is brought down, the hope is for stage 2 politics, when people can actually vote on the basis of their ideological preferences. And it's that 2-stage battle that can make sense of some of these things, which maybe when you see them initially, you're scratching your head going, hang on, how does this all work? And maybe is one of the reasons why Navalny has been such a complex figure. So hopefully that is something that we introduce in the book that can be applied to other settings, not just elections.
Okay, thank you so much. We do already have several questions. Let's start with questions from the audience. And please introduce yourself, because it's not that easy to recognize everybody's face behind the mask. So, lady, please.
Thank you. My name is Alexei Navalny. I'm a historian of East Central Europe, Ukraine in particular. So Navalny's position on Ukraine is pretty ambiguous. His comment on Crimea, comparing it to a sandwich with buterbrod kolbasoi, has become infamously legendary. What's your assessment of his position towards Ukraine? Is it also about adaptability? If it is, he's making it very difficult for Ukrainians to support his cause.
I'd like to add one more question which came from internet. It's the question of Robert Otter. It's connected to this one. Do you see any evidence that Navalny has promoted civic nationalism, inclusive rather than ethnic nationalism?
On the Ukrainian question, so first maybe I should explain the reference to the sandwich. Navalny was asked in 2014 about the annexation of Crimea or reunification of Crimea to Russia, as the Kremlin or people who support that move say in Russia. And Navalny's position was to say that was trying to, we think, occupy kind of middle ground between nationalist or pro-Kremlin position and hardline liberal positions. He said very clearly that the annexation of Crimea was an annexation, and that it violated all international commitments of Russia, that it violated international law. So he was very specific about that. And he was very specific about the fact that the referendum that took place there was a joke. Now, what he also said is that even though the referendum that was organized in Crimea in 2014 was a joke, that there was no real campaign, that the vote count was rigged. In his opinion, the overwhelming majority of the population of Crimea supports that move. And in his opinion, Crimea will remain a part of Russia in the near future. Now, I don't want to judge Navalny's position. I think what it shows is, once again, his attempts to distance himself from some people in the liberal opposition who have argued for a unilateral handing of Crimea back to Ukraine, and on the other hand, not wanting to toe the Kremlin line too closely, and to denounce what he called the annexation of Crimea, and not calling it a reunification, which is something that matters today in Russian politics. And I think it's also, getting back to your question about, it makes it difficult for Ukrainians to support Navalny. Navalny has been, even though he calls for international sanctions on Russian oligarchs or on the Russian leadership, he has always been, I think, very clear on the idea that the West will not save Navalny, and no other nation, will save Russia, and that he is a Russian politician vying for the votes, for the support for the people coming to the streets in Russia of Russians.
Yes, please.
Maybe I can add to this and also link to the question on nationalism. So I think this is an excellent case to demonstrate the one big point we make in the book, the complexity of Navalny. He isn't the person that people, or many people in the West, would like him to be, right? This is an issue where he's clearly taking a position that's, comfortable with a majority in the Russian population, but certainly not a majority in the West. And he's clearly taking the pragmatic side, whatever people in this room perhaps might think about that. And the same goes for the nationalism. That was a period when he strategically used that in order to appeal to a majority of the population to build a coalition against the undemocratic regime. And the idea here was not so much, obviously, to really bring forward ethnic nationalism, but what he tried to do was a civilized nationalism that we also see in some European parties emerging. That is sort of more of the civic type, but that still isn't completely distancing itself from the ethnic type as well. It's a little bit of a dog whistle included sometimes. And that is also a strategic choice that we might not be comfortable with, but that belongs to Navalny as the political phenomenon that we try to explain.
Thank you. Richard Sakwa, please. Yeah, wait for the mic, please.
Yeah, Richard Sakwa, University of Kent. First of all, I'd like to say how lovely it is to see people physically here and to have this discussion. I think it's an extremely important discussion. It's quite clear that for a number of years, there's been two active figures in Russian politics. One of them is a well-known figure living in the Kremlin, and the other one is obviously someone who's not living there, Navalny. And so I think it's marvelous that this book has come out. And in fact, I think it's achieved its goal of showing the complexity, and it's extraordinarily balanced work. So I just wanted to say that first. So that's absolutely great. There's a number of, many questions. Maybe I'll just focus on two. It's quite clear that somewhere along the line, a decision was taken to squash the opposition and including Navalny. There are rumors, and if you have some information, I'd love to hear it. In the autumn of 2019, allegedly people got together and they decided to finally tighten the screws. It's been happening on a conservative social level for a long time, but this was on a political level. In a sense that Navalny has been indulged by the regime, as we saw after the Kurovlets case. He didn't go to jail. Then, of course, he was allowed to stand because Sobyanin shows that those team, if you like, the Bashnia, the Kremlin Tower, which was in favor of, was supporting him. I mean, in a sense, that somewhere along the line, there was a crucial. And I wonder whether in all of your talks and such like, you've got a sense of what was a changing balance, who lost out, who won. And now, of course, we're going for the full scale, as you say, tightening of the GAEC, of the screws and so on. So, and also what that means for the very strategy of evolution within the system, which many of us have been arguing for many years, that there's potential within the system quite clearly in the last couple of years that has much more reduced. Can I just ask another point, which you've touched on many times, but it's one which particularly concerned with Ilarionov and Yavlinsky and so many others keep saying that what Navalny is doing, and it's reflected in some of your comments today, what he's doing is reproducing classic Russian personalism, that top-down centralization, that he hasn't actually been able to move out from, as you've described, zones. So in a sense, he's not the answer. He is a continuation of the problem itself, of authoritarianism within the system. You could put it political culture, you could call it many different things. But somewhere or another, and as I say, this is why many of his own, what would have been his supporters, are alienated. And just the question just touched on just now, which was going to be my point as well, is that, is there somewhere ever that Navalny actually said something sympathetic about the inhabitants of the North Caucasus or Kyrgyz and Tajik guest workers in Russia? I spend a lot of time with these people and, they say to me, this guy is actually dangerous. We will obviously support the existing system because, and this is the danger of the stage 1 and stage 2. We know what happened to stage 1 and stage 2 in 1917. It never got beyond, well, stage 2 wasn't exactly where we were expected to go. And so these people are arguing precisely that Navalny will open up some sort of new type of, in other words, it isn't really dialogical, it isn't really, democratic movement, but it's one spawned by the perverted nature of politics itself. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Richard. Let me add one more question from our online tube pipe. And this comes from James Nixie, who first of all thanks his best to you and tells that this is incredible and beautifully balanced achievement. But his question can be added to Richard's first. It's, do you believe Navalny is or was someone's creature? If so, could you go a step further and speculate as to whose and does it matter or not? Does it matter or not if Navalny was or wasn't somebody's creature? Please, who wants to be the first?
We don't get into that in very much detail in the book, partly because we just don't have the information. We wrote the book, I should remind people, in under 2 months. And I should say many thanks to Michael Dwyer, who's in the audience, the publisher of Hearst, who took on the project and allowed us to write a book and publish it so quickly. I'm sure other publishers, we know other publishers weren't on board with that time frame. So thank you, Michael, for that. But you're right, there are some moments in his career where it's clear that somebody has intervened and said, it's in our interest for this person to be free. One of the clearest cases you mentioned relating to 2013 mayoral election in Moscow. So the boring answer is that no, I don't think I have a sense about which tower in the Kremlin has supported him in the past. But it's certainly the case that it is highly likely that there has been that cliche, just from what we know about how Russian politics operates more broadly. But to your question about when a decision was made to change their softer approach, their management of Navalny rather than stamping him out. You mentioned autumn 2019. I think that certainly was a clear moment when they saw protests and we saw the heavy-handed response from the authorities, that it was clear that thinking was changing. But I would point maybe to another consequential decision, which was Navalny trying to stand in the 2018 presidential election. According to Bellingcat and Partners' investigation, that does seem to be the moment at which Navalny started to be tracked. And that's consistent with the idea that Navalny had reached a certain level of, he had a certain stature, a level of public recognition and a following that made him a danger to the system, whereas before he maybe was more controllable. So I think, yeah, maybe slightly earlier than 2019 was when people were starting to think that a more drastic move was likely, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised if autumn 2019 just convinced more people that something had to change.
On the personalist question, and you on nationalism, perhaps?
Yeah. Okay, we can do this.
Good. I was just trying to use the opportunity to bring back the supporters and the activists of the movement to this question on, is it a personalist movement? Is it reproducing the personalism that's already in the system? And I think, obviously, yes and no. So there are conflicting tendencies here. One thing is, of course, Navalny is heading this movement very consciously as a charismatic leader, as somebody who is very difficult to replace that we see right now. So his person is very important for the movement, his humor, his inspiration that he brings, and all the, obviously also the top-down centralized organization. That's all there. But on the other hand, I want to add a perspective that I've gained when I interviewed his activists and supporters in the Russian regions. And there has been usually from Kremlin-controlled news agencies or other outlets, the narrative of Navalny the manipulator, somebody who uses Russia's youth in his own political agenda. And what I've been hearing from his activists is actually the other way around, that many people are using Navalny in precisely the stage 1 battle as an instrument, as somebody they see is best placed, or was best placed perhaps, to achieve major political change and then reorient to other political forces that then might emerge. And this is certainly something that's not just one quote that popped up time and time again in the interviews, and also in the survey that I did with Andrei Semyonov and Irina Sirotkina in 2018, where the same thing comes up, Navalny as the instrument rather than Navalny the leader. So there are these conflicting tendencies, and I think what we see now with increased support for the KPRF, perhaps also increased ideas of tactical voting more generally, that is something that speaks against the personalization idea. That's something that sort of speaks to a more strategic orientation rather than simply following personality. So there are both of these tendencies there. Very academic answer.
Yeah, and I would add to this a brief point, is that I think there's also, in this discussion about personalization, charisma, and the Russian opposition, there's a kind of double bind here where people will complain that when there's no charismatic leader, people will complain that, oh, they're all bland and gray and they're not attractive to the population. And then when a charismatic figure like Navalny appears and constructs his own charisma, I don't think he's just came from somewhere like this, people will say, oh, that's personalization, that's bad, it's not collective enough. So I think there's a fine line to follow here between these two double binds. But getting to the question about racism, which is of course the big question about Alexei Navalny. Navalny has used ethnic and racial dog whistle in the past. That's clear. You read his blog from the until a couple of years ago. Clearly, you find this. Clearly, and some human rights defenders in Russia have said that clearly this is a man that has ethnic and racial prejudice. It's not something that now features very high on its agenda. I think he's not talking about this anymore. The only thing he says that remains from his nationalistic agenda is that Russia should have a more restrictive immigration regime, because now people from several Central Asian republics can come freely to Russia without a visa, and he's proposing that they should be under a visa regime, and that in order to curb illegal immigration to Russia. These are not political positions that I approve of, but I think this is my opinion, and this is fairly irrelevant to Russian politics, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, but this is how it is. I think it also connects to the difference, to something that Tamila was pointing about, which is the Russian middle class today. And I think that this position is a popular position in Russia. These use of racial ethnic dog whistles are popular in Russia, and it speaks to, I think, the difference between the Russian middle class and Western middle class, and the fact that in Russian society, these positions may be more popular and less frowned upon than they are in the West now. And it's something that we also try to do in the book, is to project less on Navalny and put Navalny in the Russian context. And because Navalny is charismatic, he speaks English, he knows Western culture, and you can get this idea that he's like us, like that he's almost Western. And I think what we try to do by tackling these things that might be less politically correct, say, in the West, we try to put him in the Russian context and in context of Russian society, which is, even though there is a Westernized middle class, which is still very different from Western countries.
Yeah, Tamila, please.
Sure, yes, I thank you for bringing up my earlier points, because I was also thinking about this, something you wrote in your book about, and you cite Green and Robertson book on the co-constitutive nature of power in Russia. So even support for Putinism is not entirely fabricated. There's genuine popular support for the kind of nationalist patriotic agenda that he espouses. And the same goes for Navalny. And that raises bigger questions about how does democracy deal with these kinds of issues of, and close to home, or clearly with Brexit as well. You know, politicians were not attuned to popular sentiment on Brexit or immigration, etc. And Navalny shows his sensitivity to what appears to be genuine public sentiment. And again, going back to Russian history, you know, there is that dilemma of, you know, the intelligentsia, should they just dismiss the views of the narod, the people, as sort of dark, ignorant masses? Should they try to educate them? When they try to educate them or sort of reshape their views, that could also backfire, and these divisions will continue. So I think this is a kind of dilemma of how democracies deal with these uncomfortable issues of popular sentiment in the electoral arena. Do they tap into them? And of course, in Navalny's case, I clearly see, even from the evidence you cite about what he said about Lizginka, let's ban the Caucasian dance Lizginka because it goes against the cultural code of Moscow city, you know, that there is a clear kind of manipulative strand there. It's not just he's reflecting and trying to kind of articulate at the policy level, you know, with regards to limiting migration, issues of popular sentiment, but he's also clearly perhaps amplifying it. Maybe there's that dimension as well.
Just
yes, please.
Quick response. You mentioned the book by Sam Green and Graham Robertson, speaking about the co-construction of power. And we speak about the book, how the Kremlin has clearly courted an emotional connection with the population, but we also shouldn't forget the other dimension, which is the fear of the unknown. And for those people who don't necessarily buy the substance of the Putin regime, they might worry, well, what would replace it? And I think we can't lose sight of that important fear of instability, a return to the 1990s and the chaos, but it also applies to Navalny himself. That for lots of Russians, they've heard this all before. Somebody saying, I'm going to build a better and brighter future. And they might think about Yeltsin and the promises of the Democrats in the early 1990s that were dashed so horribly, led to default in 1998, led to social, political, economic chaos. So I think even for those people who are sympathetic to what Navalny has said, what he believes in, they might be reluctant to turn out on the street to support him because of that fear that it could lead to instability. And then one final point, but because of the stage 1 and stage 2, we do see people turning up to support him who don't agree with him and his policy positions. And that's certainly something that comes across in the interviews that Jan did in the regions between 2017 and this year, as well as the comments that people gave at the protests earlier this year. I don't agree with what he said, but he's the best placed person to take down the current system.
Owen, are you eager to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond a bit to that the remark that you made, Tamila, about the tension between the intelligentsia and the people in Russian politics and history. And I think it's very important thing that Navalny said, and he said fairly early on, you find this in a book he wrote with a journalist in 2011, is that Navalny rejects that idea that there is dark masses that need to be educated by a special elite. He refuses that division of Russian society between intelligentsia and people. And he says, well, it's not true that there is cattle like bydla, like they say in Russian. Of course, you have something like a middle class educated people that should play a role in politics, that maybe should play a kind of enlightenment role. But he believes that the people fundamentally share the same values. And he says, and it says also this in the context of corruption, where he says, well, everybody knows that corruption is bad. It's not something that is ingrained in the people's mentality, that they're stupid, that they're retarded because they support corruption. He says, no, the people know that. And he has been attempting to politicize these issues, but starting with that assumption that fundamentally people want to live better. Fundamentally, people understand that giving bribes to a police officer is something that is not good and that we should change and we can change.
Okay, thank you. I do not see any raised hands. So, yes, please.
Roderick Lyne, member of Chatham House. Thank you for this excellent review. And I look forward to reading the book. There's one sort of slightly awkward question I'd like to put to you. Given where Navalny now is, and given the way that his movement has been effectively, as you said, rolled up and suppressed, what do you see as the future for Navalny and his movement? Does he have a future?
I think that Jan is best positioned to talk about the maybe more hopeful portion of this response, but the depressing short-term, medium-term answer is that Navalny is going to be in prison for the next few years and likely even longer. There are other charges that have been made against him that would keep him behind bars for a long time. So for Navalny the man, the future looks quite bleak at the moment. Also for the movement, if we look at just the organizations, they've been labeled extremist and they've been dissolved. So that is the negative short-term response, but I know that Jan is going to give a slightly more positive spin. Maybe.
Okay, I'll try my best. So I think what's really, what was impressive when I did these interviews with his supporters between 2017 and 2021 was precisely the hope and the enthusiasm that they brought to this movement, that they thought by working in this movement, they had realized that it pays off, at least personally for them, if not policy-wise. It pays off to do something in a situation that looks pretty hopeless from the outside. And that wasn't just one or two people, that was really, in one article, we've called it a new generation of activists. That's perhaps a little overstating it, but there's really a point to that. People who were inspired by Navalny's movement to engage in their local areas, in their local constituencies, and trying to emancipate themselves from Navalny's brand, because obviously that's what they have to do, because otherwise they cannot do anything. They can be repressed, they can be even imprisoned, but they cannot even stand in elections. But dissociating themselves from Navalny, but taking all of the experience, all of the connections, all of the knowledge that they gained over the last couple of years, and trying to channel that into new projects that might not be visible to us because they're not covered in international media, but that certainly exist. Tomilia you have spoken about these little projects a little bit before. And these projects continue, although of course on a very low level, and even on this low levels, they are sometimes frustrated. I could go into the details of that, but that would get us into depressing territory again. So I just stop here and say the enthusiasm lives on, even though it's channeled in other directions.
Okay, Orwan?
Yeah, I will add a quick point to this. Again, getting back at a point that Tomila made, is that Navalny today has become one of the leaders, or the leader. I mean, I don't think it's a very interesting debate, but of the liberal opposition and of people who want a more democratic regime in Russia. And we know that there is a constituency for this in Russia. It may not be the majority of the people. It's probably not the majority of the people in Russia today, but Russia is a middle income country with a middle class, more or less independent from the state, as you said. And this is a constituency that exists in Russia. And it's something, by the way, that Navalny pointed to in his latest New York Times interview, is that he is, in a way, a symptom of the fact that this constituency, this part of the Russian society, is not represented in the political system in Russia. And these people, some of them are emigrating, of course, but most of these people won't go anywhere. And this is the big question mark about the future of the Russian political system: is what place can these people have in Russian politics? Whether that will be with Navalny, Navalny's associates, who are now most of them, for the top ones, in the West, or with some other political movements, be it, like we mentioned before, the Communist Party or some other liberal organization, we don't know, but these people do exist.
And relating to that, they can lock him up, they can destroy his organizations, but the underlying grievances that meant that that movement was able to build and to grow over time, they haven't gone away. It's not as if just by winning a constitutional majority, according to the official results, United Russia getting a constitutional majority in the State Duma, that they've magically got rid of all of these problems in society. No, prices will continue to rise. Corruption will continue to be a systemic issue, and that will continue to be a problem. And insofar as those underlying grievances aren't tackled, then the Kremlin certainly hasn't dealt with arguably a much greater challenge, existential challenge to himself, to itself, compared to just one individual and his movement.
Okay, to keep on positive note, let's switch a little from Navalny's future to Russia's future. Perhaps it's more hopeful. And there are three questions we got from internet. One is of Galina Michkovich. She's asking about growing repressions by the state of free speech and independent opinions through the historically familiar enemy of the state, prison. How likely is the Kremlin to continue this further, reminding us of Stalinism, to cut off the heads of outspoken leaders? Where do you think is the Kremlin headed? Then there is another question by Jemima Hudson. How do you think the Kremlin will deal with Navalny going forward? Will they attempt to slap new charges on him to extend? You did elaborate on this a little bit, but perhaps you'd like to react a little bit more. And what narrative will Russian media seek to spread on him? Is he still an insignificant blogger or a danger to political stability? And the last of this series is, how likely is it came from Joshua Bean, how likely is the KPRF to become a meaningful home for the opposition with Navalny in jail? Broadly speaking, is societal discontent widespread enough for a broad coalition? And as we are approaching the end of our discussion, let me ask each participant of our panel, Tamila, you're welcome as well, to share your views answering these questions and looking ahead in future of Russia, Russian political regime and Russia in whole. Yes, please, who is the first to start?
I can start perhaps on the question, where's Russia headed? And I think there are two competing hypotheses that we might look at and see what's the result. One is that Russia's leaders are still rational, and that is there are theories that say authoritarian regimes, modern authoritarian regimes, only apply as much open repression as needed. It's not something that they do because it's fun to them. It's something that they do because they want to retain power. And if they can retain power by other means, as Russia has done in the past, mostly by controlling the flow of information, by sort of blocking candidates before they even get to the ballot, that's not visible to most in the population, right? So manipulating rather than repressing, if they can do that, then they will continue doing that. And that would mean that now the repression would sort of not increase any further, because they've now made a point, and now they can go on starting from here and not have to go into full Stalinism or totalitarianism or whatever you want to call it. That assumes that Russia's leaders are rational, which doesn't have to be the case. It could simply be the case that people have taken over who are genuinely afraid of what whatever Navalny represents to them, and who are now trying to stamp all of this out completely. And again, this is Kremlinology, obviously, and I can't engage in that. But I think there are these two scenarios that are possible, and one might, have to hope and rely on remaining rationality in the Kremlin. I don't have a definitive answer on that, but I have, the offer of these two hypotheses at least.
Thank you again, Tamila.
Yes, so I'm also picking up on some of the things that the panelists were saying earlier and the questions that were just asked about what next in terms of Russian future and future of activism and Navalny, etc. It's actually interesting to see, and the question was raised about whether Navalny's smart voting tactics were successful or not, and there's some sense that they were not, because after all the wizardry that the regime has done overnight, there's less kind of apparently less vote has gone to the smart voting candidates. But on the other hand, if you look at it this way, you can see that the tactic worked, because you can look at this as a barometer of the early results, the preliminary results as a barometer of the success of this tactic, and then the fact that they were then doctored and manipulated as a kind of gauge to how much frustration and anger we will get from the people. And I would like to bring in the parallel of 2011. If we were back in 2011, that's exactly what happened. The people knew what votes or which parties were getting, and then the official results came out, and there was massive anger which spilled out on the streets. Of course, Navalny is now in jail, and we're not going to see people in the streets, but I think the pent-up anger will keep growing. And this anger, it will also stem from the kind of socioeconomic, which we haven't touched on very much, the economic vulnerabilities and challenges in the context of sanctions, etc., COVID, etc. That it kind of adds up to this pent-up frustration. So my worry is that there will be some kind of trigger, and it might not be a political, but some kind of trigger of a socioeconomic kind, perhaps of a nationalist kind, that would sort of bring out these bubbling tremors to the surface. But again, one could never hold a crystal ball on Russian politics and speculate anything with any great certainty.
Thank you. Morvan?
Yeah, I would first say that I think that it is to be expected that growing repression will take place in Russia, maybe not because of the rationality of the people who are in charge, but just because you now have an enormous security apparatus, bureaucratic apparatus with people who have been taught for more than 10, 15 years now that there are internal enemies in the country, and you already have careers built on this, on prosecuting new cases, finding new people who made a bad comment on the internet or something like that. So even getting a bit lower from the level of decision making, you clearly see that there is a routine manufacture of political cases for likes on Vkontakte or for comments on Facebook. And I think it's from a bureaucratic point of view, it's difficult to stop such a machine when it is started, and when you have a generation that has been raised in the security services, in the police, in the Center Against Extremism, raised on this idea that Russia is surrounded by enemies and that there is a fifth column in the country. It will be, I think, more difficult to refrain from this as long also as you have strong tensions between the West and Russia, which also allows, for right or wrong reasons, but to fuel that idea that Russia is surrounded by enemies that have their collaborators in the country, such as Navalny, for instance. So this is for the kind of bleak view on the future of repression in Russia. And another point that leads me to be bleak, perhaps Jan can pick up after this, but he's already done a lot to give some glimmers of hope, is what we're seeing now, and that clash that wasn't between the internet giants and Russian authorities. One, we haven't spoke that much about this aspect of Navalny's career, is that he was able to become a politician mostly because of the internet and because of the extraordinary freedom that the Russian internet had for more than 20 years now. And he was one of the pioneers of that political internet in Russia, first on LiveJournal, then on Instagram for pictures of his family, then on Twitter, then on YouTube, where he has created a huge audience and what is basically a professional network, even if it doesn't run 24/7, of course, but it still has millions of views. What will happen to all this if there isn't a Navalny, or looking beyond that, if political use of YouTube, of Facebook, of Twitter is not, or even, as we've just seen, of Google Docs, is not possible in Russia? And this is, of course, we're seeing as how internet freedoms are slowly being eroded in Russia in the last years. But there is still some dramatic moves that the Kremlin could make that would drastically reduce the availability of opposition political messaging in Russia. And this is, of course, something that is very worrying.
Thank you, Morvan. Dan, please.
Very quickly, I agree with what Morvan said about the bleak outlook for whether we're going to see the same level of repression or more. I think we're going to see more, and part of that is because just the mode of governance has shifted, and it's tricky to see how the Kremlin will row that back when the narratives are just so seductive and easy, talking about foreign interference, when things can be blamed, when allegations of vote rigging, when the state frames them as, oh, this is just some type of intervention from foreigners, a coordinated campaign. That's such an easy narrative, and I can't see the Kremlin rowing back on that. So I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic going forward. I don't think we're going to see a post-election thaw. And more broadly, this equation of opposition, political opposition, and treason is something that will be very difficult to shift away from. On the question about how the state media is going to portray him, I think their basic strategy is that they're just not going to mention him. He's locked up. And that's, it's not a question of how do they talk about him on the evening news. They just don't talk about him. And if he is mentioned, then he's portrayed as a stooge of the West, as a CIA agent. On the Communist Party question, I think that's fascinating. It's going to be really interesting going forward to see how the existing tensions within the party between the sort of Moscow-based older elite and the younger, more radical activists in the regions, how that plays out is going to be fascinating, and could be, if we want to end on an optimistic note, a way in which we can see looking at how that plays out is another way of looking at how the energy that was started by Navalny's movement might continue. That it could be that these younger activists find a new home in the Communist Party, and that we see some really interesting politics play out there within the party.
Thank you, Ben. To reformulate famous Bismarck's phrase, I would say that Russia's future never is that hopeless and dark as we are afraid of, but it's never that hopeful as we would like to see it. And with saying this, I'd like to thank our brilliant presenters today. Let me name them one more time. Tamila Lankina, thank you so much. Jan-Matti Dolbaum, Ben Noble, and Morvan Lalouet. I'd like to thank also all those who did participate actively or passively in our discussion online or offline, and to thank those who made it possible for us to have this wonderful hybrid event today. Thank you so much. With saying this, I'd like to attract your attention to the piece put by Anna on our next event on Russia-Germany relations. And thanks a lot, and hopefully we will continue in hybrid format and in even more comfortable format. Thank you so much. Goodbye.